In June 2025, the fragile silence between Iran and Israel broke again. A missile launch from southern Lebanon triggered Israeli airstrikes deep into Syrian territory. Not long after, cyberattacks crippled parts of Israel's transport infrastructure. Tehran denied involvement. Jerusalem issued warnings, and the world held its breath. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were signals, loud and unmistakable, from two nations locked in a rivalry shaped by decades of distrust, regional ambition, and ideological divide. But before we dive deeper into the past, it's important to understand where the power stands today. Because this isn't just a standoff between two nations, it's a proxy chessboard, with global players on either side and shifting alliances behind every move. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran has positioned itself as the spiritual and strategic leader of anti-Western resistance in the region. Its power isn't just in missiles or soldiers, it's in influence, ideology, networks. From Lebanon's Hezbollah to Syria's Alawite regime, from Iraq's Shia militias to Yemen's Houthis, Iran has built a web of proxy groups, all bound by anti-Zionist rhetoric and Shia identity. But Iran isn't isolated. As tensions with the West grew, Russia and China stepped closer. Moscow provided weapons and political cover in Syria. Beijing offered vital economic lifelines amid crushing US sanctions. This new alignment, authoritarian powers backing Iran, has shifted the balance of regional influence. Once surrounded by hostile neighbors, Israel now commands a different kind of power. Its alliance with the United States remains unshakable, fortified by billions in military aid, diplomatic protection, and shared strategic interests. But the real turning point came in the 2020s. The Abraham Accords, normalization agreements with Gulf, states like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco marked a dramatic shift. Saudi Arabia, while officially distant, began cooperating behind the scenes, bound by a shared fear: Iran. In the background, Israel developed elite capabilities in cyber warfare, missile defense, and covert intelligence. Unit 8200, the Iron Dome, Stuxnet. It became less reliant on traditional warfare and more dominant in digital and psychological battlegrounds. The Middle East has become a battlefield of proxy dynamics, not just armies, but ideologies, media narratives, and alliances. Iran claims to defend the oppressed, to resist imperialism. Israel frames its actions as defense of a nation, of a people, of an ancient promise. And in June 2025, both sides returned to familiar strategies. Iran denies orchestrating the cyber attacks, but Israeli officials point to familiar fingerprints. Israel's retaliatory strikes in Damascus are met with condemnation in Tehran, but praised in Gulf media circles. Once again, war is fought in the shadows and the screens as much as in the skies. But to understand how we reached this moment, how two countries with no shared border could become so entangled in conflict, we have to go back. Back to a time before the slogans, before the revolution, to a time when Iran and Israel weren't enemies, but strategic friends. Today, the very idea seems surreal, but for nearly 3 decades, Iran and Israel were not enemies but allies, not just casual diplomatic partners, but strategic collaborators in one of the most sensitive and volatile regions on Earth. Before 1979, Iran, under the Pahlavi dynasty, maintained deep security and economic ties with Israel, nurtured away from the public eye, but crucial to both nations' survival and influence. Mohammad Reza Shah came to power in 1941, but it was only after the CIA and MI6-backed coup in 1953, which overthrew Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, that his reign solidified. With strong support from Washington, the Shah became a pillar of Western power in the Middle East. He launched a sweeping campaign of modernization, westernization, and secular nationalism, what he called the White Revolution. Land reform, women's voting rights, education, and rapid industrial development followed. And with that came geopolitical alignment. Iran, though overwhelmingly Muslim, became a de facto partner of the West, including Israel, whose very existence was not even acknowledged by most Arab states at the time. In the 1950s and 60s, Israel was regionally isolated, surrounded by hostile Arab regimes who saw it as an illegitimate state. Iran, though not Arab, emerged as a quiet, valuable ally. Iran supplied crucial oil to Israel, circumventing the Arab-led oil embargoes. Israel, in return, shared military intelligence, agricultural technology, and expertise in desert farming and water management. In an era before satellite surveillance, Israel even operated a covert listening post in northern Iran, pointed directly at the Soviet Union. Some of these operations were hidden under joint business ventures, others masked through foreign intermediaries. Yet the collaboration was constant, pragmatic, and born from necessity. One of the strongest ties was between the Shah's secret police, Savak, and Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service. Israel helped train Savak agents, introducing interrogation techniques, surveillance tactics, and counter-espionage strategies, knowledge rooted in Israel's constant war readiness. The two nations shared intelligence not only about regional threats like Egypt and Iraq, but also about internal opposition and Marxist insurgencies that threatened the Shah's regime. Some of these collaborations, particularly in surveillance, would later become flashpoints of resentment during Iran's revolution. Under the Shah, Iran's Jewish population, then the largest in the Muslim world, thrived. Jewish Iranians held parliamentary seats, owned businesses, and operated synagogues openly. Many Jewish Iranians, while maintaining a strong cultural identity, felt integrated and protected by the Shah's secular policies. And some of them, seeing the alliance between Iran and Israel grow, emigrated to Israel, forming an early bridge between the two societies. Today, the Persian Jewish community in Israel numbers over 200,000, many of whom still speak Farsi at home and carry vivid memories of their ancestral homeland. The Cold War shaped every alliance. Iran, Israel, and the United States formed a strategic triangle aimed at containing Soviet influence and suppressing Arab nationalist movements, particularly under Nasser in Egypt and later Ba'athist Iraq. When Israel fought in the 1967 and 1973 wars, Iran, unlike most Muslim-majority states, did not cut ties and continued to supply oil. Though the Shah never formally recognized Israel, the reality on the ground was active and cooperative. Perquisite, economic inequality, political repression, and cultural discontent brewed beneath the surface. Many religious Iranians began to see the Shah as an agent of the West, corrupt, authoritarian, and dangerously close to the Zionist regime. Anti-Israel rhetoric intensified among Islamic opposition groups, not just as a matter of foreign policy, but as a symbol of what had gone wrong with Iran's identity. In early 1979, the revolution reached its crescendo. The Shah fled into exile, and Iran was no longer the Iran that Israel or the United States once knew. The new Islamic Republic wasted no time. Diplomatic ties with Israel were severed. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was handed over to the Palestine Liberation Organization. Anti-Israel slogans appeared in textbooks, banners, and government speeches. The previous friendship, now seen as betrayal, was wiped from official memory. It's hard to imagine now, but for a generation, Iran and Israel worked together, learned from each other, and shared a vision of modernization. That era ended not with negotiation, but with revolution. And in its place emerged a new reality, one that would define the Middle East for the next 4 decades, a zero-sum struggle between the Islamic Republic and the Jewish state. 1979, a year that changed not just Iran, but the entire Middle East. After years of rising protests, strikes, and religious opposition, the monarchy of Mohammad Reza Shah collapsed. In its place rose a government unlike any the modern region had seen before, an Islamic republic built on theology, resistance, and revolution. And almost overnight, Iran's relationship with Israel was not just severed, it was reversed. The Shah's departure in January 1979 marked the end of a deeply polarizing era. While the elite and upper classes had grown wealthy under his rule, many Iranians, especially in rural areas and among the clergy, felt left behind, alienated by his secularism and crushed under his secret police, Savak. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a former exiled cleric, returned from France and quickly became the symbol of the new Iran, a country that no longer looked west but looked inward and upward. Khomeini's vision for Iran was clear. A state built on Shia Islamic jurisprudence, rejecting Western influence, and firmly opposing what he saw as oppression by imperial powers. At the center of this worldview stood 2 enemies, the United States, the Great Satan, and Israel, the Little Satan. The new regime declared that Israel had no legitimacy. The Israeli flag was pulled down from its embassy in Tehran. In its place, the flag of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Where once Israeli technicians worked in Iranian oil fields and desert farms, their presence became unthinkable. Where once the Mossad and Savak exchanged intelligence, now both sides monitored each other from afar, not as partners, but as enemies. The language shifted too, from policy to theology, from security concerns to existential threats. The anti-Zionist ideology wasn't just rhetoric, it became institutionalized into the very fabric of Iran's new foreign policy. Jerusalem was no longer just a city, it was a symbol of defiance, injustice, and religious duty. Unlike traditional rivalries based on borders or trade, Iran's enmity with Israel became ideological, framed in terms of divine justice, resistance, and martyrdom. Khomeini's government began supporting Palestinian groups, especially those aligned with Islamic resistance, and in the 1980s would help form Hezbollah in Lebanon, a development that would define Iran-Israel tensions for decades. Iran's identity as a revolutionary state came to depend on its role as the leader of resistance against both the West and Israel. It was no longer just foreign policy, it was faith-based foreign policy. For Israel, the revolution was a strategic shock. An ally had turned into a vocal adversary. The intelligence infrastructure Israel had spent years building in Iran was suddenly useless, or worse, compromised. Worse still, Iran was not like its Arab neighbours. It was not part of the Sunni Arab League bloc, nor had it been militarily defeated in past wars. Iran was a proud, ancient civilization, newly motivated by religious fervour, and rich with oil and regional ambition. Israel now had to contend with a non-Arab, ideologically driven state, one that was more patient, more global in its reach, and increasingly willing to operate through unconventional means. The revolution triggered a shift in alliances across the Middle East. Iran aligned itself with Syria, and eventually with Russia and China, forming a loose coalition of states and movements opposed to US and Israeli interests. Israel, meanwhile, doubled down on its alliance with the United States and began reaching out quietly to Gulf monarchies, who also feared Iran's growing reach. The seeds of future conflicts in Lebanon, Gaza, Iraq, and even cyberspace were planted during these transformative months. In the aftermath of the revolution, most of Iran's 80,000 Jews fled. Some went to the US, others to Israel, but thousands chose to stay. While the Islamic Republic does not recognize Israel, it does recognize Judaism as a protected religion. Jews have continued to live, worship, and vote in Iran, but always under close scrutiny. Their existence today stands as a complex reminder that hatred of Zionism in Iran does not always equal hatred of Jews, a distinction the regime frequently insists upon, but one the West often struggles to interpret. But the revolution of 1979 didn't just topple a monarch. It flipped the Middle East's strategic map and rewrote the script for Iran's role in the world. For Israel, it marked the end of a rare window of regional cooperation. For Iran, it marked the beginning of a mission, one that would increasingly define its foreign policy, its alliances, and its place in the eyes of the West. The quiet partnership between the two nations, once built on oil, trade, and quiet pragmatism, was now replaced by an enduring tension shaped not by logic, but by belief. For nations that do not share a border and have never fought a direct war, Iran and Israel have spent the last 4 decades locked in one of the most complex, persistent rivalries in modern geopolitical history. But theirs is not a conflict of open declarations and formal armies. It is a shadow war, one waged in foreign lands over encrypted networks, in whispered alliances and under layers of plausible deniability. Since the early 1980s, Iran and Israel have fought each other by proxy, by sabotage, and by surrogate actors. Their battlefield spans not just the Middle East, but the diplomatic chambers of the United Nations, the backrooms of European capitals, and the digital frontier of cyber warfare. This is the era of quiet confrontations, where power is projected through influence, patience, and precision. The seeds of the shadow war were sown in the early 1980s during the chaos of the Lebanese civil war. Lebanon had collapsed into sectarian violence, and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, had established strongholds in the south, launching attacks into Israel. In response, Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee in 1982, sending troops deep into Lebanese territory. The official objective was to neutralize the PLO threat. But the invasion had far-reaching consequences that extended far beyond Palestinian fighters. As Israeli forces occupied parts of Lebanon, Iran quietly moved in. In the Bekaa Valley, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, operatives began training a new Shia militia, one that would come to embody the Islamic Republic's ideological and military doctrine abroad. That group was Hezbollah, the Party of God. Formed in 1985, Hezbollah quickly became a multifaceted force, part militia, part social movement, part ideological vanguard. It blended religious zeal with political calculation, loyal to Tehran's vision of Shia resistance, yet deeply embedded in Lebanese society. Hezbollah wasn't just a local actor, it was Iran's first major proxy success. In October 1983, a suicide bomber drove a truck packed with explosives into the US Marine barracks in Beirut. Moments later, a second bomber targeted French paratroopers. 241 American servicemen were killed. It was the deadliest attack on US military personnel since World War II. Though Hezbollah denied involvement, intelligence assessments pointed to Iranian fingerprints, not just in ideology but in funding, logistics, and training. The bombings marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one that blurred the lines between state and militia, between terrorism and ideology. Israel took notice. It would spend the next 2 decades grappling with a non-state enemy backed by a powerful, ideologically committed state far beyond its northern border. By the late 1990s, domestic pressure mounted inside Israel. Casualties were rising. Hezbollah's tactics, ambushes, IEDs, rocket fire, were proving effective. In 2000, Israel withdrew its forces from southern Lebanon, ending an 18-year occupation. But the withdrawal was not framed as a concession. It was a strategic recalibration. For Israel, the lesson was clear. Iranian influence in the Levant was real, growing, and far harder to dislodge than any conventional enemy. Hezbollah had evolved into a formidable force, one that now operated as Iran's long arm on Israel's doorstep. As the 1990s progressed, both sides deepened their reliance on covert operations. Israel's Mossad began targeting Hezbollah and Iranian operatives across Europe, the Middle East, and even Latin America. These weren't dramatic public battles. They were surgical strikes, car bombs, mysterious illnesses, unclaimed explosions. Iran responded in kind, often through the IRGC Quds Force, a clandestine wing responsible for foreign operations. One of the most infamous cases was the 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, followed by the 1994 AMIA Jewish Community Center bombing, which killed 85 people. Though never definitively proven, Israeli and US officials have long accused Iran and Hezbollah of orchestrating the attacks. By the early 2000s, Iran had constructed a vast web of influence across the Middle East. Each partner served a unique purpose. Hezbollah, deterrent against Israeli aggression. Syria, strategic ally and weapons conduit. Iraq, a buffer zone against Sunni powers. Gaza, pressure point against Israeli civilians. Yemen, a southern front to distract Saudi Arabia and US interests. Together, these actors formed the so-called Axis of Resistance, a loose but coordinated coalition whose existence reshaped regional geopolitics and kept Israel on constant alert. Rather than match Iran's network with proxies of its own, Israel doubled down on technological superiority. It pioneered new forms of deterrence. Preemptive airstrikes on Syrian convoys, targeted assassinations of Hezbollah commanders, cyberattacks on nuclear and military infrastructure, psychological operations to expose or embarrass Iranian covert operations. One of the clearest examples of this strategy would come later, with the Stuxnet cyber attack, reportedly developed by Israel and the US, targeting Iran's uranium enrichment facilities. But long before Stuxnet, the blueprint was already in place. Strike quietly. Leave no fingerprints. Deny everything. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Iran entered a brief period of reformist governance under President Mohammad Khatami. Hopes surged for a détente. Cultural diplomacy increased. Iranian cinema flourished. Some academics and policy experts speculated that a slow thaw between Israel and Iran, if not official recognition, might eventually emerge. But reality intervened. The rise of hardliners in Tehran, Israel's increasing alarm over missile programs and proxy entrenchment, and the Second Intifada shattered any illusions of rapprochement. The shadow war, never truly paused, continued with renewed urgency. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Iran-Israel conflict had evolved into something both vast and intimate. It spanned borders, but rarely used armies. It involved civilians, but was waged by intelligence agencies. It shaped entire regional alliances, but remained officially undeclared. And looming over all of it was a deeper fear, one that would dominate the next chapter of their relationship: nuclear power. Some weapons are never fired, yet they shape history. Some wars are never declared, yet they define generations. In the Iran-Israel rivalry, no issue looms larger than the question of nuclear weapons. It is a story of ambition and fear, of secrecy and sabotage, and of a region perpetually on edge. To Israel, a nuclear-armed Iran is an existential threat. To Iran, a civilian nuclear program is a sovereign right and a strategic necessity. Between these two views lies decades of mistrust, geopolitical gamesmanship, and shadow warfare that has pushed the Middle East to the brink more than once. But Ironically, Iran's nuclear program began with help from the West and from Israel. In the 1950s and 1960s, under the US-led Atoms for Peace program, the Shah's government began building nuclear reactors for energy and research. Israel, which already possessed advanced nuclear knowledge, reportedly shared information in the early stages of Iran's atomic infrastructure. The Shah even dreamed of building 20 nuclear power plants and explored the idea of a bomb, not for immediate use, but as a future deterrent in a hostile neighborhood. But the 1979 revolution halted most of this progress. Western scientists left. Contracts were cancelled. Infrastructure rusted. Still, the idea of nuclear independence never died. For the Islamic Republic, isolated and surrounded by adversaries, the ability to enrich uranium became not just a matter of science, but of survival, pride, and deterrence. Israel's view of a potential Iranian bomb is shaped not just by strategy, but by memory, the Holocaust, the repeated invasions of its territory, the declarations by Iranian leaders that Israel should be erased from the map, the funding of groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. For us, for Israeli policymakers, a nuclear Iran is not just unacceptable, it is unthinkable. Though Israel has never officially confirmed possessing nuclear weapons, it is widely believed to maintain an arsenal of 80 to 200 warheads based at undisclosed sites. This policy of ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying its nuclear capability, has allowed Israel to deter regional threats without inviting scrutiny. But ambiguity only works if adversaries believe it can be used. And when Iran's nuclear program accelerated in the early 2000s, Israel's tolerance began to fray. In the early 2000s, Iranian exiles leaked documents showing secret nuclear activity. Satellite images confirmed it. Underground enrichment at Natanz, heavy water facilities at Arak, fortified bunkers in Fordo. Iran claimed its intentions were peaceful, to power cities and reduce oil dependence. Critics argued the scale, secrecy, and enrichment levels hinted at weaponization. Israeli intelligence, deeply alarmed, sounded the alarm to Washington and the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. By 2006, the UN Security Council had imposed sanctions. Iran pushed back, insisting on its non-negotiable right to enrich uranium under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. The situation escalated into a global standoff. Iran kept enriching, sanctions deepened, and Israel began preparing for covert intervention. Unable to halt Iran's program through diplomacy, Israel turned to its most trusted weapon, secrecy. In 2007, Israel allegedly worked with the US to launch a cyberattack using a virus called Stuxnet, a sophisticated worm that infiltrated Iranian control systems and caused centrifuges to spin out of control. It was the world's first known digital weapon targeting a physical infrastructure, and it worked, setting back Iran's program by years. But that was only the beginning. Over the next decade, a campaign of assassinations unfolded. Iranian nuclear scientists were gunned down in traffic, blown up by magnetic bombs, or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Iran blamed Israel, often with reason, though Israel remained officially silent. These attacks, while effective in the short term, inflamed Iranian nationalism and pushed the program deeper underground, literally and figuratively. In 2015, after years of multilateral negotiations, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, was signed between Iran and 6 world powers. Iran agreed to reduce its uranium stockpile by 98%, limit enrichment to 3.67%, allow near-daily inspections of its nuclear sites, dismantle thousands of centrifuges. In return, crippling international sanctions would be lifted, allowing billions to flow back into the Iranian economy. The deal was hailed as a diplomatic triumph, but not by Israel. In 2018, US President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, citing Iranian missile tests and regional aggression. Sanctions returned, even harsher than before. Iran, feeling betrayed, began violating the deal's terms step by step. Uranium enrichment restarted. Centrifuges spun faster. Transparency declined. Iran's government, meanwhile, leaned harder into its defiant narrative, blaming Washington, rallying the domestic economy, and doubling down on regional proxy efforts. Any hope for a permanent peaceful resolution began to fade. In the 2020s, the confrontation entered a new phase. Israeli intelligence launched daring raids, including one in 2018 that seized Iran's entire nuclear archive from a secret Tehran warehouse. Iranian hackers allegedly infiltrated Israeli water systems, hospitals, and private companies. Israeli cyberattacks paralyzed Iran's ports and fuel distribution. The digital battlefield had expanded, and it had no boundaries. The pressure rises, the trust collapses, and the future remains uncertain. The nuclear issue is not resolved. It may never be. It is a story of perceptions, of survival and suspicion, of two nations convinced that only strength will secure their future, even if that means forever living in the shadow of a war that neither side wants but both prepare for. Religion is often seen as a source of peace, of meaning, of sacred truth, but it can also shape how nations define themselves and how they see others. In the decades-long conflict between Iran and Israel, religion is not just a backdrop. It is a central force, woven into the language of resistance, justification, and national identity. This is not a religious war in the medieval sense, but neither is it purely political. It is a conflict in which theology becomes ideology and faith becomes foreign policy. The modern state of Israel was born in 1948 out of both Zionist nationalism and Jewish historical trauma. For its founders, Israel was not merely a safe haven for Jews. It was a restoration of biblical homeland, deeply rooted in ancient covenantal ideas. The Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh, is filled with references to Jerusalem, Zion, and the land of Canaan, locations that today exist in modern-day Israel and the Palestinian territories. Even Israel's national anthem, Hatikvah, speaks of the hope of 2,000 years, a poetic expression of exile and return. But Israel is also a secular democracy. Roughly half of Israeli Jews identify as non-religious or traditional rather than orthodox. Religious parties hold seats in parliament, and rabbis often weigh in on issues of war, territory, and peace. To many Israelis, Zionism is not just political, it's sacred. This spiritual nationalism is part of what makes the Iran-Israel conflict so volatile, because on the other side stands a nation whose identity is also founded on religious revolution. Iran's 1979 revolution did not just overthrow a king. It established a system of religious government based on Shia Islamic jurisprudence, led by clerics and ultimately a supreme leader believed to hold divine political legitimacy. Shia Islam is distinct from Sunni Islam in both theology and worldview. Central to Shia belief is the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, who was killed at Karbala in 680 CE. This event is not just remembered, it is relived symbolically every year. It teaches themes of oppression, sacrifice, resistance against tyranny, and gives religious justification for standing against unjust rulers or foreign powers. For Iran's ruling clerics, Israel is not merely a political rival. It is portrayed as a modern-day Yazid, the tyrant of Karbala, responsible for oppressing Muslims and occupying holy lands. The doctrine of Mustazafin, the oppressed, versus Mustakbirin, the arrogant powers, further frames Iran as a defender of the downtrodden, and Israel as an instrument of imperial arrogance. Khomeini infused this theology into politics. Zionism was cast not as a Jewish movement, but as a global injustice, an ideology of occupation and arrogance, to be resisted as a religious duty. Importantly, Iran's leadership often distinguishes between Jews and Zionists. Judaism, as a monotheistic religion, is recognized and constitutionally protected in Iran. Iranian Jews have a seat in parliament, run schools, operate synagogues, and celebrate festivals openly, albeit under political scrutiny. But Zionism, as defined by the Islamic Republic, is framed as a colonial secular nationalist project that uses Jewish identity as a shield for occupation. This distinction is politically convenient, but it also stems from theological reasoning. Some Shia clerics argue that the return to the Holy Land should only come with the arrival of the Mahdi, the prophesied saviour of Islam. In this view, modern Israel is a premature and illegitimate attempt to claim divine fulfillment, a rebellion against God's timing. While this view is not held by all Muslims, it has been influential in shaping Iranian clerical narratives. Iran positions itself as the leader of the Ummah's resistance, not just the Shia, but all Muslims who reject imperialism and occupation. Al-Quds Day, Jerusalem Day, was introduced by Iran in 1979 and is observed annually on the last Friday of Ramadan. They reinforce Iran's legitimacy as the vanguard of the Muslim world, even while alienating Sunni regimes that have normalized with Israel. On the Israeli side, religious Zionist groups have deepened their claims to sacred land, especially in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Some settlers cite the Book of Joshua, claiming divine right to the land. While most Israelis support a two-state solution or status quo, these fringe theological views gain outsized influence when political tensions rise. In this way, religion becomes both sword and shield, used to mobilize, to justify, and to fortify national narratives. Both Iran and Israel contain messianic undercurrents in their national theology. Though often unspoken in diplomacy, they shape public perception and long-term political imagination. In Shia Islam, the belief in the return of the Mahdi, the hidden 12th Imam, is central. Some Shia eschatology teaches that his return will coincide with chaos in the region, particularly near Jerusalem, and the defeat of oppressive regimes, while Iran's leadership has often denied basing policy on apocalyptic belief. Figures like former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad spoke frequently of the Mahdi's imminent arrival. In Jewish belief, the concept of Mashiach, Messiah, includes visions of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem and a period of universal peace, often following intense global conflict, while mainstream Israeli leaders do not publicly govern with messianic logic. Fringe movements advocate rebuilding the temple, even at the site of Al-Aqsa, a move that would spark catastrophic religious war. Not all religious voices embrace confrontation. In both countries, there are scholars, theologians, and activists who seek dialogue, reinterpretation, and peaceful coexistence. There are also Jewish and Muslim thinkers who challenge the use of sacred texts to justify violence and who advocate for a new religious ethics rooted in dignity, not domination. The conflict between Iran and Israel is not a holy war, but it is one in which the holy is never far away. In speeches, symbols, flags, and festivals, faith permeates the struggle. It defines righteousness, it sets boundaries, it promises justice, sometimes violently. Yet religion can also offer pathways to something different: repentance, reinterpretation, redemption. Whether those paths will ever be chosen remains uncertain. Wars are no longer always fought between standing armies. In today's Middle East, the battlefield is everywhere, and the combatants are often invisible. For decades, Iran and Israel have been engaged in a quiet but fierce proxy war, conducted not through tanks and treaties, but through militias, drones, hackers, and indirect influence. It's a war fought by others in other countries, but orchestrated from Tehran and Jerusalem. And while the hands may be hidden, the consequences are painfully real. This is the reality of proxy warfare in the 21st century. This is how Iran and Israel shape the region, without ever officially going to war. Survival and deterrence through asymmetric influence. Lacking the air superiority or nuclear arsenal of Israel, Iran has built a web of non-state actors, ideological allies, and foreign militias, many of them Shia, but not exclusively. These forces allow Iran to project power far beyond its borders, apply pressure on Israel, and retaliate indirectly, all while maintaining plausible deniability. During the Syrian civil war, Iran became Bashar al-Assad's chief backer, providing troops, cash, and advisors. In return, Syria serves as a transit hub for weapons to Hezbollah and a launchpad for IRGC operations. For Rujia, Iran wields influence over numerous Iraqi militias, especially Kataib Hezbollah and Hasht al-Shaabi, many of which receive weapons and training from Tehran. These groups have targeted US bases, Israeli-linked sites, and dissidents. Primarily focused on the Saudi-led coalition, the Houthis have increasingly adopted anti-Israel rhetoric. Iranian-made missiles have occasionally threatened Red Sea trade routes and, indirectly, Israeli-linked interests. In recent years, the war has gone digital. Both sides engage in psychological warfare, leaking videos, hacking billboards, or impersonating officials online. Iran's proxy expansion has reshaped the region, not just militarily but diplomatically. Fearing Iran's reach, several Arab states have quietly aligned with Israel. The UAE and Bahrain signed normalization deals in 2020. Saudi Arabia maintains back-channel security coordination. Egypt and Jordan uphold peace agreements, wary of Iran's influence. These new alliances are not based on shared values, but shared threats. Iran, in turn, deepens its ties with Russia and China, finding new patrons for arms, energy, and diplomatic cover at the UN. Proxy warfare has turned the Middle East into a multipolar battlefield, where alliances shift, but the core tension remains. Iran's drive to project power, Israel's vow to contain it. The tragedy of proxy warfare is that those who fight are rarely those who die. Civilians in southern Lebanon live under the shadow of Hezbollah rockets and near Israeli target zones. Syrians, already brutalized by civil war, are caught between Iran's military footprint and Israel's airstrikes. In Gaza, children grow up knowing the names of drones and the sound of sirens before they learn how to read. Conflict often dominates the headlines and defines the history books. But behind every rivalry, there are quieter moments. Moments where peace seemed, even briefly, possible. Between Iran and Israel, those moments have been rare, but they've existed in secret meetings, in reformist movements, in international halls of diplomacy. This is the story of what almost happened, of what might have been, of peace efforts and missed opportunities, fragile, fleeting, and never quite enough. Long before revolution and rhetoric, Israel and Iran maintained a quiet but meaningful relationship. The Shah of Iran saw Israel not as a threat, but as a strategic partner, one that shared common enemies and Western alignments. Intelligence agencies, Mossad and Savak, coordinated on regional threats. Israeli experts worked in Iranian agriculture and defense, and while there was no formal recognition, there were frequent covert meetings. Some of these back channels continued even into the early months of 1979. Israeli officials, hoping for a transitional period, maintained informal ties with figures close to Khomeini. But when the revolution hardened, those contacts evaporated, the embassy closed, the rhetoric escalated, and the window shut, fast and permanently. Nearly 2 decades later, a new moment emerged. In 1997, Mohammad Khatami, a moderate cleric, won Iran's presidential election with nearly 70% of the vote. He spoke of dialogue among civilizations, advocated cultural exchange, and signaled openness to engagement, even with adversaries. His tone toward Israel was softer, if still critical. While the Islamic Republic still refused recognition, overt calls for Israel's destruction decreased. Iranian state media began covering Jewish cultural events more positively. Reformist newspapers published essays on coexistence, including translations of Israeli works. In private, there were rumors of indirect talks, through European intermediaries, at academic conferences, through UN events. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak cautiously acknowledged these shifts, saying, "We're watching developments closely. Hope exists, but it is fragile." But Khatami's influence was limited. Real power still lay with Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who distrusted normalization. Reformist media were shut down. Student protests, initially pro-dialogue, were suppressed. The moment passed, the rhetoric returned, and the dream of détente dissolved again. In 2003, a year after the US invasion of Afghanistan, and months after the fall of Saddam Hussein, a stunning diplomatic overture emerged from Iran. In what's now called the Grand Bargain Proposal, Iran allegedly sent a confidential proposal to the US through Swiss intermediaries. The offer stunned many, especially since it included recognition of Israel in exchange for normalization with the West. But the timing was poor. The Bush administration, emboldened by military success in Iraq, ignored the proposal. Some called it a missed opportunity on a historic scale. In Israel, the proposal was never publicly addressed, but former Mossad and Shin Bet officers later acknowledged it as serious and albeit risky. The chance faded as fast as it came. The most significant diplomatic opening in decades came in 2015 with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. While Israel had no seat at the table, the deal shaped its foreign policy for years to come. For the Obama administration, the JCPOA was a non-proliferation agreement, not a regional peace deal. But for Iran, it offered economic relief and international legitimacy. And for Israel, it was a threat, a temporary delay, not a permanent solution. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu campaigned vigorously against it, even addressing the US Congress in 2015 to oppose the agreement. And yet, for a brief moment, Iran was more open to the West than at any point since 1979. Reformist voices grew louder. Iranian students travelled abroad. Israeli analysts began to speak cautiously at a window. But again, the window shut. In 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, reinstating sanctions. Iran's government turned hard again. Moderate hopes collapsed, and the war of shadows resumed. Within both countries, there have always been voices, and often quiet, often punished, calling for understanding. Many have been arrested. Reformist newspapers are routinely shut down. Activists are forced into exile. In Israel, there are scholars, former intelligence officers, and peace advocates who believe Iran is not monolithic, and that engagement should be part of strategy. But in the shadow of rockets and assassinations, these voices are often drowned out. As the security apparatuses grow louder, the peacemakers fall silent. In the 2020s, the Middle East changed again. The Abraham Accords normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Saudi Arabia, once openly hostile, now engages in quiet coordination with Israeli intelligence. Common fear of Iran's growing reach has reshaped old alliances. But this realignment, rather than softening the Iran-Israel divide, has hardened it. Iran now sees normalization with Israel as Arab betrayal. It increases its support to proxies and doubles down on anti-Zionist messaging. In response, Israel's regional network deepens, including energy deals, arms transfers, and shared air defense grids. Each peace treaty with an Arab state makes peace with Iran less likely, at least for now. At the heart of every missed opportunity lies one central issue: trust. Iran believes Israel will never accept an Islamic republic in its backyard, even if it moderates. Israel believes Iran's calls for resistance are not symbolic, but strategic and existential. Each side sees the other's gestures as traps, not openings. Each believes that any pause in hostility will be exploited as weakness. In diplomacy, timing is everything. But when timing never aligns, even peace becomes a weapon. Decades of tension, countless proxy conflicts, secret operations, assassinations, sanctions, cyber strikes, and words that wound deeper than weapons. This has been the story of Iran and Israel, two nations that once shared cooperation, now defined by confrontation, bound not by borders, but by a rivalry that spans ideology, identity, and survival. And yet, even now, in 2025, the question lingers, where do we go from here? As of June 2025, the situation is tense, but familiar. Iran has resumed enriching uranium at near weapons-grade levels. Israel has increased its airstrikes in Syria and sharpened its warnings of a red line. Hezbollah's arsenal grows. Gaza remains volatile. Iraq simmers with proxy militia activity. The JCPOA is effectively dead. No new agreement has replaced it. US diplomatic influence in the region has waned. Russia and China now play a growing role, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. Raijda. Internally, both countries face pressure. Iran's economy is strained. Protests simmer beneath the surface. Israel grapples with polarization, global criticism, and growing domestic anxiety over the forever conflict. Neither side wants war, but neither trusts peace. The region holds its breath. Again. In the worst-case scenario, mistrust gives way to miscalculation. A single Israeli airstrike hits too deeply, perhaps killing a senior IRGC commander. Iran responds with missile strikes, perhaps not directly from Tehran, but through proxies in Lebanon or Syria. Hezbollah joins in. Hamas fires rockets. The Houthis close the Red Sea. Israel retaliates hard, targeting Tehran's military and nuclear facilities. Cyber attacks follow. Oil prices skyrocket. Refugees flood the region. The US is drawn in, so is Russia. The result? A regional war with global consequences. This scenario is feared by analysts on both sides. But it remains possible, if not probable, as long as red lines remain undefined and communications remain indirect. A more likely path, and the one we're currently walking, is prolonged containment. Israel continues its campaign between wars. Regular airstrikes, cyber sabotage, diplomatic isolation. Iran continues to expand its influence through Hezbollah, Iraq's militias, Syria's rebuilding, and Gaza's armament. Occasional flare-ups occur, but both sides avoid open war. It's a cold conflict, not peace, not war, a balance of pain and pressure. The danger? Normalization of instability. Generations growing up, seeing the other only through the lens of threat. A future with no memory of coexistence, only rivalry. History has a way of surprising us. The impossible has happened before. Egypt and Israel signed peace after decades of war. The Soviet Union dissolved. Arab states normalized with Israel in exchange for tech and security. Could Iran transform? Could Israel offer trust where it once offered preemption? If leadership changes, or if internal reform movements gain power, there is a distant possibility that Iran could reassess its foreign policy, especially as a new generation less tied to the revolution comes of age. Likewise, if Israel sees sustained regional peace and reduced proxy threats, it may reassess its policy of absolute deterrence and consider new channels of dialogue. This scenario may seem idealistic. But diplomacy is often about preparing for the improbable, and behind closed doors, voices on both sides continue to explore alternatives, quietly, carefully, but persistently. Tries, a growing number of Iranians, particularly under 30, do not share the revolutionary zeal of the 1980s. Many are more concerned with jobs, personal freedoms and dignity than geopolitical ideology. They use VPNs to watch Israeli music videos. Some listen to Israeli analysts in Persian on Telegram. Others question the slogans they were raised on. In Israel, too, a new generation asks, what is the end game? Can we live forever under siege? What kind of nation will we be if we only define ourselves by who opposes us? The seeds of transformation may not come from governments, but from young people who have never met, but suspect they are not so different. The Iran-Israel conflict is sustained not only by strategy, but by storytelling. In Iran, Israel is the villain of post-colonial struggle, the symbol of arrogance and Western betrayal. In Israel, Iran is the spectre of another Holocaust, the nuclear threat cloaked in religious fury. These stories are deeply ingrained. They are reinforced by textbooks, speeches, flags, rituals, and yet all stories can be revised. Beneath the politics, there are people. Iranian Jews who still pray in Farsi, Israelis with Persian grandparents who remember Shiraz more fondly than Tel Aviv, parents on both sides who want safety, dignity, and a future without sirens. The politics are hard, the history is heavy, but the human desire for peace, however quiet, has not been extinguished. It persists. Iran and Israel are not destined to be enemies forever, but destiny alone will not change that. It will take courage, leadership, listening, and a willingness to see the other not as a threat, but as a mirror. Perhaps the time is not now, but someday it may be. And when that day comes, when the walls come down and the stories are retold, we may look back and say, we could have ended it sooner, but at least we ended it. This has been the story of Iran and Israel, a story of shadows and history, of resistance and remembrance, and maybe someday a story of redemption.